You know, sometimes it's comforting to believe that our modern world is full of irrational fears, strange beliefs, and odd superstitions. But truth be told, we're amateurs compared to the people of medieval Europe. Welcome, dear listener, to an unusually calm and cozy journey through some of the most ridiculous superstitions from the Middle Ages. Before we dive into this peculiar world of charms, demons, and bizarre rituals, take a moment to settle in. Maybe you're already lying down. Perhaps the soft hum of your fan fills the room. Let your body relax. Let your breath slow down. And while you're here, if you enjoy these long meditative explorations into history's quirks, feel free to gently tap that subscribe button and leave a little comment afterward. It helps more curious minds find their way here. And who knows, maybe the YouTube algorithm is its own kind of modern superstition. Now, imagine stepping into a world where the boundaries between religion, fear, and folklore blur into one thick fog of uncertainty. A world of stone castles, narrow cobblestone streets, and wooden carts creaking under the weight of goods. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, roasted meats, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Children chase stray dogs through the muddy lanes, while old women, wrapped in layers of rough wool, whisper warnings to one another. The village priest preaches on Sunday mornings, but come nightfall, those same villagers clutch amulets under their pillows, terrified of the shadows. It was a world where heaven and hell felt only a breath apart, where God watched from above, but so did countless demons, witches, spirits, and unseen forces lurking in every corner. Medicine was barely more than wishful thinking. Science, as we know it, hadn't yet unfolded. And so, when people encountered the unknown, whether it was an illness, a storm, or even a sneeze, they turned to superstition for answers. Why did superstition flourish so wildly in medieval Europe? Well, imagine living in a time when most of life's great mysteries had no clear explanation. Why do crops fail? Why does a baby fall ill? Why does thunder crash from the sky? Without science to guide them, people filled these gaps with stories. Stories passed down from grandmother to grandchild, whispered at market stalls, preached from pulpits, and shared by traveling minstrels. Religion played its part, of course. The church ruled both hearts and minds, but even priests struggled to explain the strange turns of fate that visited their congregations. And so, alongside their sermons, an entire unofficial world of mystical beliefs flourished. Angels and saints offered protection, but demons were always waiting to strike. In this cosmic tug-of-war, everyday people clung to rituals, charms, and bizarre habits that promised safety, or at least the illusion of control. Superstition offered comfort. If you followed the rules, didn't walk under certain trees, avoided certain animals, said the right prayers at the right times, perhaps you could ward off disaster. It gave people a sense of agency, a way to push back against the randomness of life. Tonight, we'll explore this strange, fascinating web of medieval superstitions. We'll meet black cats accused of consorting with witches. We'll learn why left-handed children were sometimes punished simply for the way they held a quill. We'll peek inside bustling markets full of fake holy relics, examine strange childbirth rituals, and discover why breaking a mirror was once far more terrifying than you might imagine. But above all, we'll approach these tales with a sense of wonder, and maybe a quiet smile, as we remind ourselves that, despite all our modern knowledge, the human mind still loves a good superstition. So now, with your breathing soft and steady, your body resting comfortably, and your mind beginning to drift, let's begin. As we move deeper into the tangled forest of medieval superstition, one particular fear stands out for its odd blend of religion, language, and cultural anxiety: the fear of the left-handed. Today, being left-handed is mostly a minor inconvenience. You might grumble about scissors, awkward desks, or smudged writing, but no one would question your morality based on which hand you use. But in the Middle Ages, things were different. Much different. The suspicion surrounding left-handed people stretches far back, but it flourished especially in medieval Europe, where superstition thrived like ivy on a crumbling castle wall. The root of this fear lies not only in old wives' tales, but in the very words people use to describe left and right. In Latin, the word for left is sinister. Yes, the same word we use today to mean evil or ominous. Meanwhile, the word for right, dexter, is where we get words like dexterity, suggesting skill, goodness, and righteousness. The language itself encoded the bias. This fear was not confined to polite company. In schools, particularly monastery-run schools, left-handed children were often corrected with disturbing determination. A child who naturally reached for a quill with their left hand might find their fingers struck with a ruler, or worse, tied behind their back to force them into using their right hand. Parents, teachers, and priests believed they were saving the child from spiritual peril or moral corruption. The idea was not simply that left-handedness was inconvenient, it was that it was inherently unnatural, a deviation from God's intended design. There were even whispers in some rural communities that left-handed children were marked by the devil himself. Mothers sometimes secretly prayed for their newborns to show a strong right-hand preference, lest the neighbors start to gossip. A left-handed baby could bring shame, suspicion, and accusations of witchcraft upon an entire family. In certain parts of Europe, folk beliefs tied left-handedness directly to witchcraft. Stories circulated of witches stirring their potions counterclockwise with their left hands, cursing neighbors with secret hand signs, and performing rituals that involved gestures forbidden to the righteous. A person seen gesturing oddly with their left hand might attract unwanted attention, or worse, find themselves accused of consorting with dark forces. Even the act of writing carried its own dangers for the left-handed. Medieval writing desks and writing tools were all designed for right-handers. Left-handed scribes often smudged their ink, making their script appear messy or difficult to read. And in a world where beautiful, clear penmanship was seen as a reflection of one's moral standing and discipline, sloppy handwriting could raise questions about a person's character. A left-handed monk with uneven script might be seen not only as untalented, but as spiritually flawed. Of course, this suspicion wasn't entirely uniform across all regions and times. In some pockets of the world, practical necessity overruled superstition. A talented left-handed blacksmith or archer might still find work and respect. But for many, especially those bound by the strict codes of church and village life, the pressure to conform was immense. Punishments for persistent left-handedness varied. In less severe cases, children might endure endless correction and discipline. In harsher instances, they might be shamed in front of their peers, labeled as cursed, or even denied certain religious rites until they demonstrated their reform. Interestingly, these fears weren't limited to childhood. An adult discovered to have ambiguous handedness, perhaps using the left hand in moments of stress or illness, could face suspicion well into their later years. In rare but tragic instances, such suspicions fed into broader accusations of witchcraft or demonic possession, particularly in times of social unrest or religious fervor. The fear of the left hand extended even into everyday customs and manners. People were taught to always pass food, gifts, or money with their right hand. To do otherwise was seen as disrespectful, if not downright ominous. Some households even trained servants to monitor and correct guests who unconsciously used their left hand, lest they invite misfortune. This deeply ingrained fear shaped not only personal behavior, but also public rituals. In courtrooms, Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Knights raised their swords in their right hands as symbols of loyalty. Even religious ceremonies emphasized the primacy of the right. From baptisms to blessings, the right hand carried divine favor, while the left was carefully avoided or ignored. One might wonder, how did these beliefs persist for so long? The answer, in part, lies in the reinforcing cycle of fear and tradition. Each generation taught the next to fear what was different, to equate left-handedness with danger and evil. The absence of scientific understanding allowed such fears to thrive unchecked, and in a world already steeped in anxieties about sin, salvation, and unseen forces, the idea of a sinister hand fit all too neatly into the medieval worldview. Of course, as centuries passed and knowledge expanded, these superstitions slowly lost their grip, but echoes of them still linger even today, in language, in cultural habits, and in the quiet discomfort some still feel around left-handedness. It's a small, curious reminder of just how deeply superstition can burrow into the human psyche. Now, as you remain relaxed, breathing softly, and drifting comfortably, we'll gently move forward, from sinister hands to even furrier omens. In our next chapter, we'll meet creatures who, despite their innocent purrs and glossy coats, found themselves at the very heart of medieval paranoia. Black cats. As moonlight slipped across crooked thatched rooftops and flickered through twisted branches, another kind of fear tiptoed into the medieval imagination, one draped in silky black fur, with gleaming eyes that seemed far too knowing. Black cats. Today, many people adore them. Some cultures even see them as symbols of good fortune. But in medieval Europe, black cats were anything but lucky. They carried an ominous weight, mysterious, elegant creatures whose very existence felt entangled with dark forces. Their association with witchcraft and the devil himself became one of the most persistent and haunting superstitions of the entire Middle Ages. To understand how this fear took root, we must again step into that medieval mindset, where spiritual danger lurked behind every turn. Illness, crop failure, sudden death. These events rarely felt random. They were punishments, curses, or signs of sin. People sought patterns to explain suffering, and often, those patterns pointed toward scapegoats. The black cat fit perfectly into this narrative. Its nocturnal habits made it seem like a creature of the night, emerging when honest folk were asleep. Its silent steps and glowing eyes felt unnatural, unsettling. And, most dangerously of all, cats possessed an independence that no other common animal displayed. While dogs were loyal, trainable, and obedient, cats wandered where they pleased, obeying no one. In a rigid, hierarchical world where obedience to God, king, and father was expected, the cat's defiant freedom was deeply suspicious. By the early medieval period, some Christian leaders had already begun painting cats, particularly black ones, as demonic companions. They whispered that witches, those women who consorted with Satan, kept black cats as their familiars. Familiars were believed to be minor demons in animal form, assisting witches in their dark rituals. The very sight of a woman with a black cat could raise eyebrows, whispers, and eventually, accusations. Village gossip became a dangerous currency. If a plague struck, if a barn mysteriously burned, if a child grew ill, suspicion often circled back to the old woman who lived on the edge of town, her black cat lounging lazily at her feet. Was she a healer, a midwife, or something far darker? People rarely waited for evidence. Fear was enough. The link between black cats and witches was further cemented by the rise of the Inquisition. Charged with rooting out heresy and witchcraft, inquisitors listened eagerly to tales of midnight rituals and strange animals. Confessions, often extracted under brutal torture, described gatherings where witches danced with the devil, while black cats slithered between their legs or whispered secrets into their ears. The line between metaphor and reality blurred under pain and hysteria. These beliefs led to horrifying consequences, not just for those accused of witchcraft, but for the cats themselves. In parts of Europe, mass killings of cats occurred, particularly during periods of heightened witch hunts. Villagers trapped, drowned, burned, or clubbed cats to death, believing they were eradicating agents of evil. Some towns even organized public burnings, where black cats were thrown onto pyres alongside accused witches. Ironically, and tragically, this war on cats may have contributed to one of the deadliest disasters in European history, the Black Death. As cats were slaughtered across towns and villages, rat populations flourished unchecked. Fleas carried by these rats spread Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, across the continent. Millions perished in waves of epidemic, while the creatures that might have helped contain the rats were systematically eliminated. In a cruel twist of superstition feeding catastrophe, fear of black cats indirectly worsened the very suffering people sought to escape. But the symbolism of black cats wasn't uniform across all medieval societies. In some regions and periods, they retained positive connotations. Sailors, for example, often saw cats, even black ones, as good luck aboard ships. They protected precious food stores from rodents and were believed to calm restless seas. A sailor's wife might keep a black cat at home, hoping its presence would safeguard her husband's voyage. But on land, particularly in the more fervent religious centers, darker beliefs prevailed. The contradictory nature of these beliefs highlights the broader tension within medieval superstition itself. People desperately sought both control and comfort. They wanted protective charms and scapegoats, saints to pray to, and demons to blame. Black cats embodied both sides of that desire, beautiful and useful, yet eerie and untamed. Stories spread like wildfire across villages and through the whispers of traveling storytellers. They told of witches who could transform into black cats to escape capture. One tale spoke of a farmer who struck a black cat with a stick, only to find his suspicious elderly neighbor limping the next morning with a matching wound. These accounts were rarely questioned, feeding the cycle of fear. Even architectural features reflected these beliefs. Some homes had witch marks carved into their beams or thresholds, protective symbols meant to ward off evil, including shape-shifting witches in cat form. Barns and stables bore similar markings, as livestock was thought especially vulnerable to magical mischief. And yet, despite these widespread fears, black cats never truly disappeared from medieval life. Farmers still quietly kept them to control mice and rats. Children still played with kittens, oblivious to the dangerous superstitions attached. The cat's aloof grace allowed it to slip through the cracks of terror, surviving even as it was vilified. As time wore on and Europe slowly emerged from the darkest superstitions of the Middle Ages, black cats remained tangled in myth. Their image softened over centuries, but never entirely. Even today, echoes of these medieval fears linger. We still flinch at the sight of a black cat crossing our path, utter nervous jokes about bad luck, or instinctively knock on wood to counter the omen. But here, in the quiet of the night, we can appreciate the black cat for what it truly is, a beautiful, mysterious survivor of human fear and folly, a symbol of how our need for explanations can sometimes turn the innocent into the accused. And now, as your breath deepens and your mind continues to drift, we will gently step forward into a world where angles, ladders, and seemingly simple shapes held terrifying power in the medieval imagination. In the Middle Ages, not even simple geometry could escape the grip of superstition. Shapes, patterns, and angles weren't just neutral designs, They carried meaning, often sacred, sometimes dangerous. And among these shapes, few inspired more subtle unease than the triangle. But how could something as simple as a triangle evoke fear? To the medieval mind, the answer was deeply spiritual. The triangle represented the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It was a perfect, divine form, symbolizing the unity and mystery of God Himself. Tampering with this sacred shape was considered not just disrespectful, but potentially blasphemous. Enter the humble ladder. When a ladder leaned against a wall, it formed a triangle. Wall, ground, and ladder itself creating three distinct sides. To walk through that triangle, passing under the ladder, was to violate its sacred geometry. You weren't simply ducking through an awkward space, you were breaking the divine order. The origins of this belief likely predate Christianity, but by the Middle Ages, it was thoroughly infused with Christian symbolism. Breaking the triangle was seen as inviting misfortune, an act that disrespected the unity of the Holy Trinity and opened the door to chaos. This fear became part of everyday life. In marketplaces, bustling towns, and narrow village streets, people carefully avoided walking beneath ladders, even if it meant detouring through muddy alleys or waiting patiently for the space to clear. Craftsmen and builders who worked with ladders learned to position them in ways that minimized foot traffic underneath, both out of practicality and to avoid provoking nervous passers-by. But there was more than just spiritual geometry at play. Ladders themselves carried associations with death and execution. Gallows often involved ladders or platforms, and criminals sometimes ascended steps or rickety ladders to meet their fate. Public hangings and executions, grim but common spectacles, linked the image of ladders with the final journey of the condemned. Walking beneath a ladder might subconsciously remind villagers of those grim scenes, feeding the sense of danger. In certain regions, whispers spread that walking under a ladder might expose a person to wandering spirits, especially the restless souls of those who had died on the gallows. Just as a noose or scaffold was charged with spiritual energy, so too was the structure that helped facilitate it. By disturbing that space, one risked drawing the attention of something best left undisturbed. Beyond ladders, the medieval world was full of dangerous angles and forbidden spaces. Certain doorways, arches, or crossroads were avoided at specific times of day or during particular lunar phases. Crossroads themselves were especially charged places, intersections where supernatural forces were thought to gather. Ghosts, demons, and even the devil were said to appear at crossroads under the cover of night. Traveling alone through such places was an act of boldness, if not outright recklessness. Superstition about spatial arrangements extended into home construction as well. Some households carefully aligned doorways, windows, and hearths to avoid creating accidental spiritual pathways through the home, which might invite evil forces inside. Folk architects whispered of invisible lines that should never be crossed, paths where spirits might travel freely if the house was improperly designed. Even the arrangement of objects on tables carried significance. Knives crossed atop one another could symbolize conflict or invite arguments within a household. Dropping a knife accidentally, especially if it pointed towards someone, could be seen as a warning of an impending quarrel or visit from an unwelcome guest. In some villages, particularly sharp angles formed by crossed cutlery were quietly rearranged by anxious housewives, lest misfortune descend upon the family. Returning to ladders, it's worth noting that not everyone who walked beneath one immediately expected calamity. Some communities developed protective rituals to counteract the risk. A person who accidentally passed under a ladder might immediately cross themselves, utter a quick prayer, or even spit 3 times to ward off bad luck. Others believed that stepping backward through the triangle, essentially reversing the offense, could neutralize the danger. Tradesmen who worked with ladders daily developed their own quiet superstitions. Painters, roofers, and masons sometimes carried small charms in their pockets or recited brief blessings before climbing, seeking protection against both spiritual and very real physical dangers. A fall from a ladder was deadly enough. No need to tempt fate further. Interestingly, some of these superstitions found reinforcement in simple practicality. Walking under a ladder was, after all, dangerous. Tools might fall, ladders might slip, or workers might drop materials from above. What began as a spiritual caution intertwined with basic common sense, making the superstition all the more persistent. As the centuries passed, the fear of walking under ladders spread beyond its medieval origins, carried through generations like a whispered warning. Even today, many people instinctively avoid passing beneath ladders, unsure whether they fear bad luck, falling hammers, or simply wish to honor some vague ancestral caution. The persistence of this belief, alongside countless others, speaks to a broader truth about medieval superstitions. They offered both a map and a comfort. In a world teeming with unpredictable dangers, from crop failure to sudden illness, even small rituals and taboos felt like shields against the unknown. Now, as you continue to breathe softly, your mind floating gently between thoughts, we'll ease our way into another corner of medieval superstition, one where fear of invisible curses led to entire markets overflowing with strange charms, protective amulets, and whispered promises of safety. As we wander deeper into the winding streets of medieval towns, past the smoky blacksmiths and gossiping merchants, we arrive at one of the busiest and most vibrant parts of daily life, the marketplace. Here, beneath colorful awnings and wooden stalls, merchants peddled everything from fresh bread to woven cloth to carefully carved charms, each promising to ward off unseen dangers. And few dangers were more feared or more misunderstood than the evil eye. The concept of the evil eye wasn't born in medieval Europe. Its roots stretch far older, deep into ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. But in the superstitious fabric of medieval life, it flourished with renewed energy, blending local folklore with religious warnings and everyday anxieties. At its heart, the evil eye was a simple but terrifying idea. That envy, malice, or even careless admiration could be transmitted through a glance. A person, intentionally or not, could cast a curse upon another simply by looking at them with too much intensity. A mother praising her neighbor's newborn might accidentally invite sickness upon the child. A farmer boasting about his healthy livestock could doom his own herd. No malicious words were necessary, only the gaze. In villages where disease and misfortune struck without warning or explanation, the evil eye provided a convenient culprit. When crops withered, when infants grew pale and thin, when once healthy adults suddenly wasted away, suspicious eyes quickly turned to neighbors who might have offered an ill-timed compliment or harbored secret jealousy. To protect themselves, people turned to an ever-expanding arsenal of charms, amulets, and folk remedies. Market stalls overflowed with strange objects, each whispered to hold power against the evil eye's dangerous influence. There were knotted strings dyed bright red, small woven pouches filled with herbs, and carved wooden tokens etched with mysterious symbols. Many believed that the color red, vibrant, full of life, repelled dark forces and neutralized envy. Animal parts also played a central role in these protections. Tiny bags containing the teeth of wolves or bears were thought to carry the strength and courage of the beast, defending the wearer against malevolent energy. Dried rabbit paws dangled from belts and cribs, while tiny horns or claws were sewn into children's clothing. The logic was often rooted in sympathetic magic, using part of a powerful creature to absorb or deflect spiritual harm. Among wealthier families, more elaborate charms emerged. Silver medallions etched with prayers or images of saints were commissioned by anxious parents or expectant mothers. These holy relics, blessed by priests, served a dual purpose: spiritual protection, sanctioned by the Church, and public displays of piety and status. But the Church's relationship with these practices was complicated. Officially, many church leaders condemned the use of amulets as pagan or superstitious. Sermons warned congregations not to place faith in trinkets and talismans, but rather to trust solely in God's providence. Yet at the same time, monasteries and abbeys quietly profited from selling blessed objects, crucifixes, relic fragments, and sacred medallions that promised divine protection. In some cases, the very priests who denounced folk amulets would secretly bless them for generous donors. The marketplace reflected this uneasy balance. Alongside sanctioned holy items, less official merchants sold charms infused with older pre-Christian beliefs. Amulets bearing strange runes or symbols of ancient fertility goddesses could be found tucked beside rosaries and prayer beads. This fusion of pagan tradition and Christian faith created a rich, sometimes contradictory spiritual economy. Mothers, particularly, were among the most devoted customers for these protections. Infants were seen as especially vulnerable to the evil eye, their pure souls easily targeted by wandering malice. Tiny charms were sewn into their swaddling clothes or tied around their wrists. Some parents hung protective symbols over cradles, small mirrors to reflect curses back to their source, or iron nails hammered into beams to ward off dark spirits. Pregnant women, too, were constant targets of both superstition and commerce. Midwives offered bundles of herbs to be worn during childbirth, promising safe delivery and protection for the child. Garlic, wormwood, and rue were common ingredients, believed to repel evil forces and ease labor pains. In some regions, a small silver key, symbolizing safe passage, was tied to the pregnant woman's belt. The evil eye wasn't always blamed solely on humans either. Certain animals were thought capable of casting it unintentionally. Snakes, owls, and particularly certain breeds of goats were viewed with suspicion. A goat whose eyes followed a child too closely might be relocated or even slaughtered to prevent misfortune. Merchants selling these charms operated not just as vendors, but as semi-spiritual advisors. They whispered advice on how to properly activate an amulet, when to replace it, and which combinations of charms offered the strongest protection. Some even claimed to sense the presence of curses and offered special amulets for cleansing and purification, for a price, of course. Entire families sometimes invested considerable sums into layers of protection. A home might contain dozens of charms hung above doors and windows, buried beneath thresholds, or hidden inside walls. Travelers carried small pouches of protective herbs when journeying through unfamiliar lands, believing that foreign eyes held unknown dangers. Interestingly, not all defenses against the evil eye required physical objects. Spitting, or pretending to spit, became a widely practiced ritual. Upon hearing a compliment or noticing someone casting a lingering glance, a person might quickly spit 3 times or mutter a protective phrase under their breath. In some places, pinching or touching wood immediately after receiving praise served as a counter-curse, a practice echoed even today when people instinctively knock on wood for luck. Despite the Church's fluctuating stance, the trade in protective amulets flourished throughout the medieval period. Fear, after all, is a powerful motivator, and the evil eye offered a simple, if terrifying, explanation for life's many unpredictable misfortunes. As centuries passed, some of these practices faded, while others quietly endured. Even in modern times, the echo of the evil eye lingers, in blue glass charms, in whispered blessings, in the subtle way people still avert their gaze from newborns, fearing to unintentionally draw envy's attention. Now, as your breathing remains soft and steady, and your mind floats gently on this long historical current, we turn to another strange corner of medieval belief, one where faith, fraud, and desperation collided in the bustling trade of holy relics. In a world starved for certainty and desperate for divine favor, few things held as much allure in medieval Europe as holy relics. To the faithful, these sacred objects offered a direct connection to the saints, the apostles, and even Christ himself, tangible proof of God's presence on earth. But in the shadows of that deep devotion, an entire industry blossomed, fueled by greed, deception, and an astonishing willingness to believe. At the heart of relic worship was a simple and deeply human longing, to touch the sacred. If one could not stand before Christ or kneel at the feet of an apostle, then perhaps standing before their bones, or a fragment of their garment, or a lock of their hair, would bring blessings, protection, and miracles. The Church, understanding both the spiritual hunger and its own political power, encouraged the veneration of relics. Cathedrals proudly displayed the skulls of martyrs, shards of the true cross, and drops of Mary's breast milk, inviting pilgrims to pray, donate, and spread tales of the relic's miraculous powers. But where desire blooms, so too does deception. The Middle Ages saw an explosion in the trade of holy relics, and with it, a thriving black market of forgery. Across Europe, bones were dug from anonymous graves, cleaned, and rebranded as the remains of saints long departed. Entire monasteries quietly acquired collections of skulls, each supposedly belonging to an apostle or a revered martyr. The fact that multiple churches claimed to house the same saint's remains rarely troubled anyone. Faith, after all, allowed for mysteries that defied logic. Consider the case of John the Baptist. At one point, so many churches claimed to possess his head that cynical observers joked he must have had multiple skulls. Similarly, countless fragments of the true cross circulated through Europe, so many, in fact, that if gathered together, they might have built not just one cross, but an entire forest. Relic dealers operated much like modern entrepreneurs, traveling from town to town with carefully packaged goods. Some carried small vials of what they claimed were tears shed by the Virgin Mary or the blood of Christ, preserved against all natural decay. Others offered slivers of fabric, said to be pieces of the apostles' cloaks, or the swaddling cloth from Christ's infancy. The trade wasn't limited to wandering salesmen. Entire abbeys and bishoprics quietly participated, driven by competition for pilgrims. Pilgrimage routes were economic lifelines, bringing travelers who spent freely on food, lodging, and donations. The more impressive a church's relic collection, the more pilgrims it attracted. And so, church officials sometimes looked the other way when the authenticity of newly acquired relics was, at best, questionable. The common folk, largely illiterate and raised in deep religious awe, rarely questioned these claims. For many, even the hint of a relic's holiness was enough to inspire devotion. Pilgrims embarked on long, dangerous journeys to visit relic sites, hoping for healing, forgiveness, or protection. Stories spread like wildfire. A blind man regained his sight after touching a saint's bone. A barren woman conceived after praying before a shard of the true cross. A sick child recovered after receiving a blessing from a priest who held a vial of holy tears. Merchants capitalized on these stories, offering smaller, portable relics for sale at markets and fairs. Pilgrims returned home with tiny bone fragments, fabric strips, or vials of sacred oil, believing they carried the power of saints with them. Homes soon filled with these items, displayed prominently as both spiritual armor and social status symbols. The creation of counterfeit relics became something of an art. Bones were often chosen for their size and color, sometimes treated with herbs or pigments to give them an ancient appearance. Skilled artisans crafted intricate reliquaries, ornate boxes or containers made of gold, silver, or carved wood, that lent further legitimacy to the contents within. A fragment of common animal bone housed in an elaborate gilded reliquary could easily be mistaken for a piece of a saint's skeleton. Relic peddlers were not without competition or danger. As the church occasionally cracked down on unauthorized relic sales, some dealers were arrested or excommunicated. Yet the demand remained so high that others quickly filled the void, always traveling, always adapting their sales pitches to fit local legends and fears. The political power of relics also played a role. Kings and nobles sought to acquire the most prized relics for their courts and cathedrals, believing that the presence of such sacred objects would legitimize their rule and curry divine favor. Entire wars were fought, in part, over the possession of particularly famous relics. One monastery's acquisition of a renowned relic could elevate its status for generations, drawing wealth and influence from far and wide. Even monasteries occasionally exchanged or sold relics discreetly, sometimes under the guise of sharing blessings with sister institutions. Wealthy patrons might commission special pilgrimages to obtain relics on their behalf, offering lavish donations in exchange for prized fragments. This quiet commerce blurred the lines between piety and profiteering, between faith and fraud. Among the most unusual relics were those that purported to contain parts of Christ himself, locks of hair, pieces of fingernails, even, in one bizarre case, alleged drops of his mother's breast milk. Entire churches were built around such relics, drawing pilgrims eager to witness these tangible pieces of the divine narrative. The authenticity of these claims mattered less than the collective belief that surrounded them. Of course, skepticism did exist. Some theologians and scholars quietly questioned the proliferation of relics, raising eyebrows at the sheer volume of saintly bones scattered across Europe. Satirists composed songs and stories mocking the absurdity of multiple skulls for the same saint or forests' worth of wood from the single cross. But for the average believer, the spiritual comfort provided by relics outweighed such intellectual quibbles. And so the relic trade flourished, wrapping itself tightly into the religious and economic fabric of medieval life. It offered hope in uncertain times, promising protection from illness, forgiveness for sins, and a closer connection to the sacred. Whether genuine or forged, these relics held tremendous psychological power, tangible anchors for people adrift in a world they barely understood. Now, as your breathing remains slow and peaceful, we drift further still, into a world where superstition clung most fiercely to the most vulnerable. Expectant mothers and newborn children, their fragile lives wrapped in layers of fearful tradition. If any phase of life drew more superstitions than death itself, it was birth. In the fragile world of medieval Europe, pregnancy and childbirth were deeply mysterious, a time when life teetered on a precarious edge. Science offered little comfort, midwives held their wisdom close, doctors were few and often ineffective, and for the average family, superstition filled the yawning gap between hope and terror. A pregnant woman, to medieval eyes, was a vessel both precious and perilous. New life grew within her, but so did danger. Miscarriage, stillbirth, or death during labor were tragically common. And because so much about conception and birth remained a mystery, countless beliefs emerged to protect both mother and child from the unseen forces believed to stalk them. Throughout Europe, expectant mothers were subject to endless lists of do's and don'ts. They were told what to eat, where to walk, what to avoid seeing, and even what thoughts to hold in their minds. A single misstep, it was feared, could mark the unborn child with deformities, bad luck, or a cursed soul. One widely held belief warned against looking at animals with physical abnormalities. Should a pregnant woman glimpse a limping dog, a crooked goat, or a deformed calf, it was feared her child might be born with similar afflictions. Midwives and family members sometimes went to great lengths to keep expectant mothers from encountering such bad omens during their pregnancy. Cats, particularly black ones, were strictly avoided by many pregnant women, another extension of broader superstitions. Contact with a cat, some whispered, could cause miscarriage or deformity. The same was said of toads, snakes, and certain types of birds, whose presence near a pregnant woman could bring harm. Certain smells were also thought to influence pregnancy outcomes. The pungent scent of burning herbs, spoiled food, or even flowers was sometimes believed to trigger premature labor or birth defects. Superstitious husbands and mothers-in-law vigilantly monitored the household air, burning specific incense or hanging bundles of protective herbs to ward off evil influences. Food played a central role in these beliefs. Some communities believed that craving or consuming particular foods could shape the child's personality or physical traits. A mother who ate too many strawberries, for example, might give birth to a child with red birthmarks. Others warned that eating fish might cause the child to be born mute, or that overindulging in honey could result in a lazy or gluttonous infant. And yet, plenty of folk remedies recommended specific foods to ensure strong bones, sharp minds, or easy deliveries, creating a maze of often contradictory advice. Superstitions extended beyond daily habits and into the very fabric of household design. Sharp objects were sometimes hidden beneath the bed or hung above doorways to cut away evil spirits seeking entry into the mother's room. Mirrors, too, were treated with caution. Some believed that a woman seeing her reflection while in pain might somehow trap her soul, complicating labor or harming the child. When labor finally began, the home transformed into a spiritual battlefield. The birth room was carefully prepared. Windows were shuttered, candles lit, holy icons positioned, and protective amulets placed beneath pillows. Midwives, who occupied a strange place between trusted healer and suspected witch, often muttered protective charms or prayers while working. Some tied small charms to the mother's wrists or ankles. Others sprinkled holy water around the bed. One common amulet involved tying a silver key to a ribbon and fastening it to the laboring woman's waist. The key symbolized the unlocking of the womb, aiding safe delivery. Similarly, certain herbs were burned or steeped in teas, believed to ease pain or hasten labor. Rue, fennel, and wormwood were particularly popular, though their true medicinal properties were often secondary to the symbolic protection they offered. Labor was also viewed as a vulnerable time for spiritual attack. It was feared that witches or malevolent spirits might attempt to steal the newborn's soul at the moment of birth, or to curse the child before its first breath. To combat this, bells were sometimes rung near the bed, or iron implements placed beneath the mattress to drive away evil forces. Family members often stood vigil throughout the night, praying and watching for signs of spiritual intrusion. After birth, the superstitions continued. Newborns were considered fragile not just in body, but in soul. Until baptized, they were thought especially vulnerable to the devil's influence. Families hurried to arrange baptisms within days, sometimes hours, of birth, fearing sudden death might claim the child before its soul was safely protected. Infants were also adorned with protective charms. Tiny pouches containing herbs, wolf teeth, or small iron trinkets were sewn into their swaddling clothes or worn on cords around their necks. Mothers might pin small religious medallions to their babies' blankets or hang talismans above the crib. Visitors to the newborn were expected to observe certain customs. Compliments were often followed by whispered prayers or the sign of the cross to prevent the evil eye from attaching itself to the child. Some guests offered small gifts or coins as symbolic payments to divert jealousy and avoid unintentionally cursing the baby through admiration. Even the act of naming the child carried superstitious weight. Names were chosen carefully, often after saints, as a form of spiritual protection. In some regions, the true name was kept secret for a time, known only to the parents and priest, to prevent malicious spirits from targeting the child. The mother herself underwent a period of spiritual vulnerability after birth. Known as churching, a purification ritual awaited her return to religious life, usually around 40 days after delivery. Until then, she was often kept away from church services and public gatherings, believed to carry a kind of spiritual impurity that required cleansing. Of course, many of these superstitions were passed down through generations of women, mothers, grandmothers, and midwives who had seen tragedy and clung to whatever rituals seemed to offer hope. In a world where childbirth was as dangerous as war, these beliefs gave families a sense of control in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. And though modern medicine has lifted much of that danger, traces of these fears still linger. Even now, expectant mothers may hear echoes of old warnings: what not to eat, where not to travel, which gifts to accept with caution. The ancient fear that unseen forces hover nearby when new life enters the world still whispers beneath our far more clinical understanding. As your breathing deepens and your body grows heavier with rest, we now drift toward another curious realm of medieval superstition, where even reflections themselves were feared as potential traps for the soul. In the flickering glow of candlelight, as shadows danced along uneven stone walls, even something as simple as one's own reflection could stir unease in the medieval mind. Mirrors, or any polished surface that returned a person's image, were not seen as harmless household items. They carried a heavy weight of superstition, mystery, and, for some, outright terror. To understand why mirrors held such power, we must return again to that medieval world. A world where the boundaries between body and soul were poorly understood, and where the unseen realm constantly threatened to spill into daily life. At the heart of mirror superstition lay a fundamental fear that one's reflection was more than a mere image. It was a glimpse into the soul itself. The reflection wasn't just a surface likeness, it was intimately connected to the person's very essence. And if something happened to that reflection, might it also harm the soul? This fear stretched across many cultures, but in medieval Europe it became especially pronounced, blending ancient folklore with Christian teachings. Mirrors, like other objects associated with vanity and self-obsession, were treated with caution. Gazing too long at one's reflection was sometimes seen as a form of sinful pride, inviting demonic influence. The devil, it was said, could exploit such vanity to worm his way into a person's heart, but the dangers extended beyond pride. Breaking a mirror, for instance, was thought to have far more serious consequences than simple bad luck. The fragile glass, so closely tied to the soul's image, shattered like the soul itself might shatter. Misfortune was believed to follow, often for 7 years, a number rich with biblical symbolism. The length of the curse may have originated from older Roman beliefs, but it took on new life in the deeply superstitious atmosphere of the medieval period. Among wealthier households that could afford mirrors, usually polished metal, as glass mirrors were still rare, strict rules were sometimes observed. Mirrors were often kept covered during storms, births, or deaths. A mirror exposed during such vulnerable moments might capture wandering spirits or even trap the soul of the recently deceased. In some communities, it was believed that an uncovered mirror in the presence of a dying person could prevent their soul from passing peacefully, imprisoning it within the reflective surface. During funerals, family members would hurriedly drape black cloths over all mirrors in the home to protect both the living and the departed. The fear was not only that the deceased might become trapped, but that mourners might see ghostly images in the glass, omens of future deaths or unresolved spiritual unrest. New mothers, too, were sometimes forbidden from looking into mirrors during their postpartum recovery, especially during moments of physical pain or emotional distress. The belief held that strong emotions, reflected back, might fracture the soul's delicate balance, inviting illness or long-term misfortune for both mother and child. Beyond their spiritual dangers, mirrors were thought to be dangerous tools in the hands of witches. Medieval accusations occasionally included claims that witches used mirrors for scrying, summoning demons, spying on victims, or casting curses across great distances. Some feared that dark rituals involved trapping victims' souls inside mirrors, leaving their earthly bodies empty and vulnerable to possession. Because of these fears, many common folk simply avoided mirrors altogether. Polished metal surfaces, such as shields or bowls, might be the closest they came to seeing their reflection. But even these were treated with a mixture of curiosity and caution. A simple glance while washing one's face might feel harmless. Staring too long risked inviting unsettling thoughts. Despite all the dangers, mirrors and reflective objects still held a kind of fascination. In some folk traditions, they were used for protection rather than harm. Small mirrored charms were sometimes hung near cradles or doorways, reflecting away the evil eye and confusing malevolent spirits who might otherwise enter the home. Just as mirrors might capture the soul, they could also deflect curses, returning malicious intent back to its sender. Craftsmen who specialized in making mirrors were sometimes regarded with quiet suspicion. To work so intimately with an object tied to the soul suggested a strange relationship with forces unseen. In certain towns, mirror makers avoided working after dark or during religious holidays, wary of attracting unwanted attention from both human authorities and spiritual entities. For those brave or desperate enough, mirrors also became instruments of divination. Known as mirror gazing or catoptromancy, this practice involved staring into a reflective surface in dim light, often by candle or moonlight, hoping to receive visions of the future. While officially condemned by the church as a form of sorcery, such practices continued quietly, often among those seeking knowledge about love, illness, or coming danger. The line between prayer and forbidden magic was, as always in the medieval world, thin and easily crossed. The pervasive fear surrounding mirrors wasn't limited to individuals either. Entire communities could react with panic to a broken mirror or strange reflection. In one recorded tale, a blacksmith's apprentice in a small village accidentally cracked a highly polished bronze mirror while cleaning it. Within days, rumors spread that the break had allowed a demon into the village. Several unexplained illnesses and a failed harvest followed, feeding the hysteria. The mirror's remains were eventually buried outside the village boundary, wrapped in protective cloth and blessed by a priest. Of course, as centuries passed, these fears softened. Advancements in glassmaking during the Renaissance made mirrors more common, and their association with superstition slowly gave way to more practical and aesthetic uses. Yet even today, the lingering echoes of those old beliefs remain. We still flinch at the idea of breaking a mirror, still wrap our superstitions in modern phrases like, just in case. As your breathing grows slower and your thoughts float peacefully onward, we move now from the silent surfaces of mirrors to another force of nature that deeply unnerved the medieval mind, the unpredictable fury of the weather itself. Throughout medieval Europe, the weather was not simply a natural phenomenon. It was an instrument of divine will, a messenger of celestial approval or anger, and, at times, a terrifying sign that darker, more sinister forces were at play. To modern minds, rainstorms, hail, droughts, or lightning strikes are the predictable outcomes of atmospheric conditions. But for people living in the uncertainty of the Middle Ages, weather was full of meaning. its every turn ripe with messages from God, saints, demons, or witches. Agriculture was at the heart of medieval life. A community's survival depended entirely on its crops, livestock, and ability to store enough food to survive harsh winters. The stakes were high. A single failed harvest could bring not just hunger, but starvation, disease, and social collapse. Because so much depended on factors outside human control, the weather became deeply intertwined with superstition, faith, and fear. When gentle rains fell and harvests thrived, villagers offered prayers of thanks, believing their piety and good behavior had pleased God. But when storms raged or the skies refused to yield rain, darker thoughts crept in. Was this punishment for hidden sins? Had someone in the village angered the saints? Or worse, had a witch cursed the land? Thunderstorms, in particular, filled many with dread. The crashing of thunder and the sudden flash of lightning were seen not simply as natural events, but as signs of God's wrath or the activities of malevolent spirits. Some believed that lightning bolts were weapons hurled by angels battling demons in the heavens, with their war echoing down to the earth below. Lightning strikes that hit churches, homes, or barns were interpreted as especially ominous. If a church tower burned after a storm, villagers whispered about secret sins within the congregation, or the presence of a witch hiding in their midst. These incidents could spark witch hunts or public confessions, as communities desperately sought someone to blame for attracting divine punishment. In some rural areas, specialized priests known as weather makers or storm priests offered prayers and rituals to calm storms. They would ring church bells during thunderstorms, not merely to warn the village of danger, but in the hope that the bell's sacred sound would drive away evil forces riding the wind. This practice was so widespread that some church bells were inscribed with protective prayers specifically intended to repel storms. Hailstorms carried their own terrifying power. Fields of ripe grain could be destroyed in minutes by ice falling from the sky, leaving families to face the long winter without enough food. Because hail seemed so sudden and cruel, many believed it was summoned by sorcery. Witches were accused of conjuring hailstones to ruin their neighbors' harvests, either out of personal spite or under the devil's direction. Special rituals emerged to prevent or break hailstorms. Farmers buried blessed candles at the edges of their fields, believing the wax carried the prayers of the saints into the soil, creating a protective barrier. Others placed iron crosses or holy relics at strategic points around their land, hoping to deflect the approaching storm. In desperate times, processions of villagers would march through the fields, singing hymns and carrying statues of local saints to plead for protection. Droughts brought a slower, more agonizing form of suffering. Without rain, not only did crops wither, but wells ran dry, livestock weakened, and diseases spread as sanitation worsened. People gathered for special masses, fasting rituals, and public displays of repentance, hoping their collective humility might move God to show mercy. In some regions, saints became closely associated with controlling the weather. Saint Medard, for instance, was called upon in parts of France to bring rain, while Saint Swithin was venerated in England with the belief that if it rained on his feast day, 40 days of rain would follow. Statues of these saints were sometimes carried into parched fields, surrounded by chanting villagers, desperate for relief. But not all weather superstitions focused solely on divine intervention. The medieval imagination also embraced darker explanations, demonic forces that tampered with the skies. Tales spread of thunder demons who delighted in whipping up storms, freezing crops, and hurling lightning at unsuspecting villagers. Some even believed that sorcerers could ride upon clouds, directing the wind and rain wherever they pleased, often in exchange for promises made to the devil. Crossroads became especially ominous during foul weather, believed to be gathering points for storm spirits or wandering souls swept along by violent winds. Travelers who found themselves at a crossroads during a storm might stop to make a quick offering or prayer, hoping to avoid drawing the attention of unseen forces. Interestingly, not all superstitions were rooted in fear. Some communities celebrated certain weather patterns as lucky omens. A brief shower during a wedding, for instance, was seen as a blessing, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. A rainbow after a violent storm was taken as a divine sign of forgiveness and renewed favor. Weather superstitions also extended into practical farming decisions. The appearance of certain animals, swallows flying high, frogs croaking loudly, ants building their mounds higher than usual, were seen as indicators of coming storms or dry spells. These observations blended genuine natural patterns with layers of folklore, offering farmers both comfort and guidance in an uncertain world. The clergy, while officially teaching that God alone controlled the weather, often tolerated or even encouraged these folk beliefs, so long as they remained within the bounds of Christian morality. After all, a community united in prayer was a community less likely to question the hardships of life or the authority of the church. But beneath the rituals and prayers lay the simple truth of medieval life. People were profoundly vulnerable to nature's whims. Every sunrise could bring hope or fresh disaster. And so, the weather remained a canvas upon which the fears, hopes, and superstitions of medieval society were endlessly painted. As your breathing remains soft and your body sinks deeper into rest, we now glide toward yet another strange realm of medieval superstition, where animals themselves became omens, their every movement interpreted as a message from forces beyond the visible world. In the medieval world, animals were far more than mere creatures sharing the landscape with humanity. They were symbols, messengers, and sometimes harbingers of doom. Every rustle in the underbrush, every unusual cry in the night, carried meaning for those who lived their lives constantly peering into the shadows for signs from forces beyond their control. Where we might today see an owl perched quietly in a tree, the medieval villager saw a sentinel of death. Owls, with their haunting calls and silent flight, were deeply unsettling to the medieval imagination. Their large, unblinking eyes and nocturnal habits made them creatures of mystery. Many believed that an owl perched near a home or barn was an omen that death would soon visit the household. The eerie call of an owl in the darkness might send entire families into anxious prayer, fearing that one of their own would not survive the coming days. Crows and ravens carried similar associations. Their black feathers, scavenger habits, and tendency to gather near battlefields or plague sites only fueled their reputation as portents of disaster. It was not uncommon for villagers to cross themselves or recite protective prayers upon seeing a lone raven circling above. In some regions, the sudden appearance of multiple crows was interpreted as a sign of an impending plague, war, or famine. Snakes, too, held a complex place in medieval superstition. While Christianity cast them as symbols of temptation and evil, thanks to the serpent's role in the Garden of Eden, rural communities often feared them for far more immediate reasons. A snake slithering across a village path was believed to bring bad fortune to anyone who stepped over its trail. If one appeared near a pregnant woman, it was seen as an especially dangerous sign, threatening both mother and unborn child. Frogs, which today might seem harmless or even charming, were treated with suspicion as well. Their sudden appearance in large numbers, particularly after heavy rains, was sometimes viewed as a sign of nature's imbalance, or worse, evidence that a witch's curse had been cast upon the land. In the Bible's plagues of Egypt, frogs had been one of God's punishments, and echoes of this story lingered in the medieval mind. Even domestic animals were not exempt from superstition. Dogs, normally beloved companions, could become ominous symbols under certain circumstances. A dog howling at night outside a home was feared to signal an approaching death within that household. Some believed that dogs possessed the ability to see spirits that remained invisible to human eyes. If a dog growled or barked at empty air, villagers whispered that a ghost or demon was surely near. Livestock were closely watched for signs of misfortune as well. Cows that refused to produce milk, sheep that rejected their lambs, or chickens that ceased laying eggs were seen not simply as economic losses, but as possible victims of witchcraft or the evil eye. In some cases, villagers would attempt to heal these animals through folk rituals, including passing them through circles of fire or sprinkling them with blessed water. Even the markings on animals carried weight. Puppies born with unusual spots or deformities might be drowned to prevent future misfortune, while a calf born with extra limbs or strange coloring could spark rumors that the farmer had angered God or fallen under a witch's curse. Superstition ran so deep that in some villages, entire herds might be slaughtered if too many strange births occurred in a single season, in an effort to cleanse the flock of spiritual contamination. Birds played a particularly nuanced role in these beliefs. Swallows, for example, were often seen as good omens, their arrival signaling the end of winter and the return of fertility to the land. But other birds, such as magpies, were treated with wary respect. In some regions, seeing a single magpie foretold bad luck, while seeing two suggested good fortune, leading to countless rhymes and rituals designed to influence the outcome. Bats were another source of unease. Their erratic flight and tendency to emerge at twilight placed them firmly within the realm of creatures associated with witches and demons. A bat that accidentally entered a home was thought to bring sickness or death, prompting hurried rituals to drive it out and cleanse the household. Beyond specific animals, the simple behavior of wildlife could inspire dread or hope. A sudden silence among birds at dawn might signal an approaching storm or even an invisible spiritual disturbance. Unusual migration patterns or the early return of certain animals could spark debates among villagers about what the coming season might hold. Hunters and shepherds, who spent long hours in the wilds, developed their own elaborate systems of interpreting animal signs. The direction from which a deer approached, the sound of distant wolves, or the behavior of birds along forest paths all became part of a silent language that warned of danger, guided decisions, and offered fragile reassurance in a world teeming with uncertainty. Superstition even extended to the way animals died. If a healthy animal dropped dead without explanation, villagers might suspect that a curse had been placed upon the household, or that an angry spirit had claimed the creature's life. The carcass would sometimes be burned, and the ashes buried at a crossroads, accompanied by prayers or offerings intended to appease whatever force had caused the death. The church, while officially discouraging many of these beliefs, often struggled to fully suppress them. Priests might remind their congregations that only God controlled life and death, yet even they were not immune to the quiet pull of folk traditions. It was not unusual for a priest to offer blessings for livestock, pray over sick animals, or participate in rituals meant to ward off misfortune, blending Christian doctrine with deep-rooted fears that no sermon could easily erase. The medieval world was one where nature itself seemed alive with intention, where every animal might carry a message, and every movement could be a sign. For those who lived close to the land, reading these omens offered a sense of understanding, however fragile, in a world governed by forces far beyond their control. Now, as your breathing remains steady and your mind floats softly in this long, winding river of history, we move gently onward to a realm of even darker fear, the silent terror of the night, where spirits and sleep demons were believed to visit the vulnerable as they lay defenseless in their beds. Nightfall in medieval Europe carried with it a special kind of dread. The sun's retreat signaled more than just darkness. It marked the return of the unknown, the unseen, and the untouchable. In those hours, when oil lamps flickered and the wind whispered through cracks in stone and timber, many believed that their souls were most vulnerable to spirits that roamed freely in the night. Sleep, though necessary, was itself a terrifying surrender. To close one's eyes was to slip into a vulnerable state, one where the body lay still while the soul drifted elsewhere, sometimes dangerously close to realms where demons and spirits lurked. And if a person happened to wake suddenly in the middle of the night, unable to move, pinned beneath an invisible weight, the experience only confirmed the worst fears whispered by generations before them. We know today that these episodes were likely cases of sleep paralysis, but in the medieval mind, this terrifying condition was nothing short of demonic assault. The most common explanation involved nocturnal demons, incubi and succubi. The incubus, a male demon, was believed to visit women in the night, pressing upon their chests, stealing their breath, and violating them as they lay frozen. The succubus, his female counterpart, preyed upon men, draining them of vitality and spirit. Both were said to cause sickness, exhaustion, and, in some cases, even death. These encounters were not merely terrifying personal experiences, they became part of wider cultural anxieties. A woman who suffered repeated episodes of sleep paralysis might be suspected of having attracted the attention of dark forces, or even of secretly consorting with demons herself. Men who experienced the paralysis described feelings of suffocation, overwhelming fear, and the unmistakable presence of something evil perched upon their bodies. The imagery of these nighttime visitations was so pervasive that it even found its way into medieval art and literature. Carvings and paintings depicted grotesque figures crouched on the chests of sleeping victims, their eyes wide with horror. Physicians, lacking any medical explanation, often prescribed spiritual remedies rather than physical ones. More prayer, stricter piety, or the intervention of priests to drive out the tormenting spirits. But not all sleep disturbances were blamed on incubi and succubi. Other, more local spirits haunted the folklore of different regions. In parts of northern Europe, for example, there was the nightmare hag, a shadowy female figure who entered homes through keyholes or cracks, sitting upon a person's chest and pressing the life from them. These hags were thought to be witches in spirit form, traveling outside their bodies at night to torment the living. To protect themselves from such nocturnal attacks, medieval families developed countless rituals and precautions. Beds were positioned carefully in rooms, often facing specific directions thought to repel spirits. Iron objects, nails, knives, or horseshoes were placed beneath pillows or hung above doorways, as iron was believed to be especially offensive to evil forces. Herbs also played a crucial role. Bundles of rosemary, lavender, or mugwort were tied above beds or stuffed into mattresses to create a protective aura. The burning of certain herbs before bedtime was thought to drive away spirits lingering in the room. The smoke, curling into every corner, symbolically filled spaces where demons might otherwise hide. Prayer, of course, was the most universally prescribed defense. Entire collections of nightly prayers and charms existed specifically for protection against sleep demons. Families would gather before bed to recite these prayers together, seeking divine protection throughout the vulnerable hours of the night. Some prayers invoked specific saints known for combating evil spirits, Saint Michael the Archangel being among the most popular. Children were considered especially vulnerable. Cradles were often surrounded by protective items, tiny bells that would ring at the slightest movement, holy relics tucked into blankets, and small mirrors hung nearby to reflect and confuse malevolent spirits. Mothers sometimes whispered blessings over their infants as they drifted off, guarding them against invisible threats. Not all fears were confined to bedrooms, however. The darkness itself was treated as an active force, teeming with unseen dangers. Those who had to venture outside after sundown carried talismans or small crucifixes, and some avoided traveling entirely on certain nights believed to be more spiritually charged than others. Eclipses, too, heightened these anxieties. The sudden darkening of the sky, whether by lunar or solar eclipse, was interpreted by many as a sign that demonic forces had grown stronger, or that the veil between the world of the living and the dead had momentarily thinned. On such nights, people stayed indoors, doors were barred, and extra prayers were offered to ward off evil. The Church, while acknowledging the reality of spiritual warfare, sometimes found itself in a delicate position. It encouraged nightly prayers and rituals, but also sought to discourage certain folk practices that veered into what it considered pagan territory. Despite these tensions, the deep fear of nighttime spirits remained a potent force, deeply woven into daily life. Even marriage was not free from these anxieties. Some couples worried that consummating their union during certain moon phases or feast days might attract jealous spirits or stir the attention of demons who envied human love and fertility. Newlyweds might delay their first night together, seeking the guidance of local priests or wise women to choose an auspicious time. As dawn broke and sunlight streamed through narrow windows, many breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for another night survived. But the knowledge that darkness would return never truly left them. And so the cycle continued, rituals performed, prayers whispered, herbs gathered, all in preparation for the next night's invisible battles. Centuries later, modern science would offer explanations for many of these nighttime terrors, but the ancient fears linger. Even now, the feeling of waking frozen, unable to move, with a crushing weight upon the chest, remains one of the most universally unsettling human experiences. And as your breathing remains steady, your muscles softened in calm repose, we approach the gentle close of our long journey. A final reflection on why, even today, strange beliefs continue to thrive within the human heart. And now, dear listener, as we reach the end of our long, quiet wander through the strange, shadowed world of medieval superstitions, it's worth pausing for a gentle reflection, not just on the odd beliefs of the past, but on the very nature of why we, as humans, believe odd things at all. The Middle Ages, for all their unique mysteries, were not so different from today in one very important way. People were desperately trying to make sense of a world they could not fully understand. Life then was fragile, short, and filled with uncertainty. Medicine was primitive. Science was little more than philosophy wrapped in hope. Diseases appeared overnight. Storms destroyed entire harvests. Children fell ill without warning. And in the face of these uncontrollable forces, the human mind naturally reached for explanations. Superstitions offered that comfort. They turned randomness into order. If crops failed, perhaps it was because someone forgot to bury the blessed candle at the field's edge. If a child was born with a deformity, perhaps the mother had seen a limping animal during pregnancy. If lightning struck the church tower, perhaps it was divine punishment, or the work of a hidden witch. These beliefs didn't arise from ignorance alone, but from a deep desire for cause and effect, for meaning in chaos. Believing in superstitions gave people agency. There was always something that could be done: a prayer to recite, an amulet to wear, a ritual to perform. The world felt slightly less random when every outcome was tied to a rule, even if that rule was unprovable. And when the outcome was good, the ritual worked. When it was bad, the ritual must have been performed incorrectly, or someone nearby had broken the rule. And perhaps most importantly, superstition created community. Shared beliefs, whether about witches, the evil eye, or night spirits, offered a common language for fear, for hope, and for comfort. Villagers gathered around shared rituals, markets buzzed with the sale of protective charms, and prayers were whispered in unison. Fear was never carried alone, it was shouldered together. But as centuries passed, science slowly chipped away at many of these ancient fears. The movements of the planets, the spread of disease, the reasons for storms, all were eventually explained in rational, observable ways. Doctors replaced midwives, meteorologists replaced storm priests. Lightning rods defended church towers more effectively than prayers alone. And yet, superstition never truly disappeared. Even today, in a world of satellites and laboratories, people still knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, or feel a chill when a black cat crosses their path. Athletes wear lucky socks. Students carry good luck charms into exams. Travelers refuse to book hotel rooms on the 13th floor. In moments of uncertainty, the old instincts still whisper. Why? Perhaps because uncertainty itself never vanished. Modern life still offers countless mysteries. A sudden illness, a tragic accident, a missed opportunity. And while science explains much, it doesn't erase randomness or bad fortune. When faced with the inexplicable, even the most rational minds sometimes reach for the comfort of ritual. Moreover, superstition is often harmless, even charming, a private comfort or a shared joke. The modern traveler who kisses their necklace before boarding a plane knows the act won't affect the engines, but the gesture soothes something deeper. It acknowledges the vulnerability we all still feel when stepping into the unknown. There's also something undeniably human about seeing patterns, even where none exist. Our brains are designed to seek connections, to notice that every time Uncle Harold wears his green hat, his favorite team wins, or that the last 2 times someone sneezed 3 times, it rained the next day. The patterns soothe us, offering the illusion of predictability. In a way, medieval superstitions remind us that, despite all progress, the human experience remains deeply emotional, deeply vulnerable, and deeply hopeful. We long to believe that our actions, however small, can influence our fate. We yearn for meaning, for protection, for a sense of control. And so, as you lie there now, breathing softly, perhaps smiling faintly at the strange rituals of long-ago villagers who burned herbs to ward off demons or clutched iron keys during childbirth, you might also recognize a little of yourself in them. The world remains vast, mysterious, and full of wonders we still don't fully understand. Superstitions, whether medieval or modern, offer us a bridge, a way to walk gently across the unknown, not because they are true in a scientific sense, but because they speak to a truth inside us, the desire to feel safe, to feel connected, to feel that we are not entirely at the mercy of fate. And with that, dear listener, we bring our long journey through the curious superstitions of the Middle Ages to a peaceful close. May your dreams tonight be free of witches, storms, and sleep demons. And if you've enjoyed this quiet exploration, you're warmly invited to subscribe and join us again for more gentle wanderings through the strange corners of history. Until then, rest well.